The man who heard her sing and said no has no monument. That is how it works with the people who get these decisions wrong, not punishment, not public accounting, simply the quiet, permanent fact of having been in the room when something historic was offered and having passed on it. He was not a villain. He was a music industry professional doing what music industry professionals do, assessing commercial potential against known quantities, measuring what he heard against what the market had demonstrated it would support, applying the expertise he had accumulated across years of listening to voices and making judgments about which of them had a future that the industry could build around. He listened to Janis Joplin in 1966 and he said no. The reasons he gave were professional and specific. The voice was too raw, too uncontrolled, too far outside the parameters of what was working in commercial music at that moment. There was power in it, he may have acknowledged. It would have been impossible to deny the power entirely, because whatever else Janis Joplin's voice was in 1966, it was not quiet and it was not forgettable. But power without refinement was not a commercial asset. Power without the kind of professional polish that allowed a record label to present an artist to radio programmers and retail buyers and the broader machinery of the music industry was, in his assessment, not enough. He thanked her. He moved on. Within a year, Janis Joplin walked onto the stage at the Monterey Pop Festival and performed Ball and Chain for 50,000 people. And when she walked off, the music industry, the same network of labels and managers and producers and radio programmers, reorganized itself around her name. Within 2 years, Cheap Thrills was #1 on the Billboard charts. Within 3 years, she was on the cover of every magazine that covered music. The man who had said the voice was too raw to be commercial watched this happen from wherever he was. There is no record of what he thought about it. That is probably appropriate. What he thought about it is less interesting than what it means, what it says about the specific quality that made Janis Joplin's voice impossible to categorize, and therefore impossible for a certain kind of professional listening to recognize as the extraordinary thing it was. What it says about the gap between what the music industry was designed to hear and what Janis Joplin was actually doing. What it says about the relationship between rawness and power, between control and authenticity. Between the voice that fits the available categories and the voice that requires the available categories to be rebuilt around it. This is the story of the rejection, not as a cautionary tale about gatekeepers, though it is partly that, but as the story of a voice that was so specifically itself, so completely outside the vocabulary that the industry had developed for assessing voices, that the rejection was almost inevitable. And why the inevitability of the rejection makes what came after even more extraordinary. To understand what the man who said no was hearing in 1966, you have to understand what the music industry in 1966 was built to hear. The machinery of commercial music in the mid-1960s had been constructed around a set of assumptions about what a successful recording artist looked like, sounded like, and was capable of. The assumptions were not arbitrary. They were built from experience, from decades of observing what sold and what didn't, what radio played and what it passed on, what audiences responded to in the numbers that justified the investment of label resources and promotional infrastructure. The assumptions were, in their own terms, reasonable. They were also, as assumptions always are, a description of the past rather than a map of the future. A successful female vocalist in 1966, by the standards the industry had developed, was technically capable, trained or trainable, capable of the pitch accuracy and tonal consistency that recording required. She was commercially presentable, which meant that her image and her sound could be packaged for the audiences the label knew how to reach. She was controllable, which meant that the label's producers and A&R staff could work with her to shape the material and the presentation in ways that served the commercial project. And she was, crucially, categorizable. She fit somewhere in the existing map of the market, in a place where the sales team could point to comparable artists and say, this is who she is, this is who will buy her records. Janis Joplin in 1966 satisfied none of these criteria. She was not technically trained in any conventional sense. Her voice had developed through listening and performing, and an internal process that had nothing to do with the vocal instruction that produced the kind of trained competence the industry was built to assess. She was not commercially presentable by any standard the industry had developed. Her image was its own thing. Her sound was its own thing, and neither of them fit the packaging frameworks that labels used to move product through the distribution system. She was not controllable in any meaningful sense because the quality that made her voice do what it did was the same quality that made it resistant to the kind of shaping and polishing that production convention demanded. And she was not categorizable. There was no existing map position she fit, no comparable artist anyone could point to and say, this is who she is. The man who heard her and said no was not wrong about any of this exactly. He was wrong about what it meant. He heard the rawness and understood it as a defect, as the absence of the refinement that commercial music required. What he did not understand, what his training and experience and the accumulated expertise of a career in the music industry had not prepared him to understand, was that the rawness was not the absence of something. It was the presence of something. That the polished, controlled, categorizable voices he was accustomed to evaluating did not have and could not acquire through any amount of training or production. Something that could only be present in a voice that had not been processed through the machinery of professional development because the machinery would have removed it. The rawness was the truth, and the truth, in Janis Joplin's voice, was the whole point. Janis had been looking for someone to hear what the man in 1966 failed to hear for most of her musical life, which by 1966 was already nearly a decade old. She was born in Port Arthur, Texas, in January 1943, into a family that was, in its specific way, slightly misaligned with the town around it. Her father, Seth, read Proust and took his children to museums. Her mother, Dorothy, worried with the particular thoroughness of a woman who understood that her eldest daughter was heading somewhere the family could not follow and could not quite prevent. The town around them had clear ideas about what a girl in Port Arthur should be, and Janis Joplin's relationship to those ideas was, from very early, one of mutual incomprehension. She discovered the blues through records, Bessie Smith and Big Mama Thornton and Lead Belly, artists who sang as though nothing mattered except the truth of what they were feeling in that exact moment. This was the music that Port Arthur didn't play, that the radio didn't broadcast, that her classmates had no framework for. It was music that had developed outside the mainstream, outside the commercial structures that the industry of 1966 was built on, and it had therefore developed outside the constraints those structures imposed. It had developed according to a different set of priorities, not commercial viability, not audience accessibility, not radio compatibility, but emotional truth. The truth first, everything else second, if at all. Janis absorbed this music the way she absorbed everything, completely, without mediation, at full intensity. She did not learn to sing blues the way you learn a technique. She learned it the way you learn a language when you are immersed in it and have no access to any other means of communication, by necessity, by total absorption, by the particular fluency that comes from having no alternative. By the time she left Port Arthur for Austin and then for San Francisco, her voice was already its own thing. Not an imitation of Bessie Smith, not a reproduction of the blues tradition she had absorbed, her own thing, built from that tradition and her own interior and the specific emotional history of a girl in Port Arthur who had felt too much for too long and had found, in the blues, the first evidence that too much was not a defect but a possibility. She arrived in San Francisco in 1966 as someone who had been performing for years, who had built a voice through practice and failure and the accumulation of nights in small venues where the audiences were sometimes warm and sometimes indifferent and sometimes somewhere in between. She had been to Austin. She had been to Venice Beach. She had been to New York briefly in the early 1960s, where she had existed at the edges of the folk scene and found that the folk scene was not quite the right context for what she was doing. She had been performing for years and she was still, by the standards of the music industry in 1966, completely unknown, and she was, by those same standards, completely unsignable. The rejection she received in 1966 was not singular. The music industry in that period was full of people who heard her and passed, who recognized that something unusual was happening in the voice but could not locate it within the frameworks available to them and therefore could not act on it. The man who said no most definitively, whose assessment most clearly articulated the industry's collective inability to process what Janis Joplin was doing, was not alone in his conclusion. He was representative of it. What made his rejection notable was not its cruelty. There was no cruelty in it. It was a professional assessment delivered professionally. What made it notable was its precision. The voice was too raw, too uncontrolled. These were not vague dismissals. They were accurate descriptions of the qualities that made the voice do what it did, understood as defects rather than as the source of the voice's extraordinary power. He named the thing. He just didn't know what the name meant. What happened after the rejection is the part of the story that the rejection makes possible. Not in the simple sense that adversity produces triumph, that narrative is too clean for what actually happened, but in the more specific sense that the rejection left Janis Joplin where she was, which was in San Francisco, which was exactly where she needed to be. Big Brother and the holding company were playing the circuit. The band had formed in the Haight-Ashbury in 1965, part of the same cultural moment that was producing the Fillmore Scene and the Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane, and the particular music that San Francisco was generating in those years. They were loud and electric and psychedelic in the specifically San Francisco way, not polished, not conventionally commercial, but doing something that made sense in the context of the ballroom shows and the light shows and the particular audience that had gathered in the Haight around a shared understanding that music could be something other than what the mainstream industry had decided it was. They needed a singer. Someone connected them to Janis Joplin in early 1966. The exact circumstances vary by account, but the essential fact is consistent. Someone brought her to the band, and the band began to play, and she opened her mouth, and the room understood immediately that something had just changed. The story of that first rehearsal has become legend among the people who were present. Not because of what Janis did technically. Her technical qualities were what they had always been, unchanged by the rejection and unchanged by the arrival at the band, but because of what happened when those technical qualities found the right context. The band was loud enough to hold her voice rather than be overwhelmed by it. The musical tradition they were working in, the electric blues and rock hybrid that San Francisco was developing, was close enough to the blues tradition she had absorbed in Port Arthur that her voice could find its natural relationship with the sound rather than fighting against it. And the audience that the band played to, the Haight-Ashbury audience, the Fillmore crowd, was not the audience of commercial radio and retail distribution that the man who said no had been assessing her for. It was a different audience with different criteria, more interested in truth than in technical polish and more capable of receiving what she was actually offering. The rawness that had been a defect in one context became, in this context, the point. The lack of control that a conventional producer would have spent months trying to manage became, in the context of the band and the scene and the moment, the quality that made the music feel alive in a way that controlled music could not feel. The voice that could not be categorized within the existing market map became, in a scene that was in the process of redrawing the map entirely, the voice that the new map was organized around. She had not changed, the context had. And this is what the man who said no did not understand and could not have understood from within the framework of the music industry in 1966, that the voice he was assessing was not designed for the context he was assessing it for. That the qualities he identified as defects were defects only in relation to a commercial framework that the voice was not built to operate within, that what he was hearing was not a raw voice that needed refinement, it was a complete voice that needed a different room. The Fillmore Auditorium was that room. The Monterey Pop Festival was that room. The stages across America and Europe that followed Monterey were that room. Every room where Janis Joplin performed from 1966 until October 1970 was that room, the voice had always needed, that Port Arthur had failed to provide, and that the record labels of 1966 had failed to recognize the need for. She found it anyway. Not because the man who said no helped her find it, but because the rejection left her exactly where she was, and where she was happened to be the right place. Monterey happened in June 1967, which was 14 months after the rejection. 14 months in which Janis Joplin and Big Brother and the holding company played the San Francisco circuit, built a following that the Haight-Ashbury scene generated and sustained, and developed the musical relationship between the voice and the band that the Monterey performance would reveal to the world. The Monterey performance of Ball and Chain has been described enough times by enough different people that the description has become its own kind of document. What is consistent across all the descriptions, from the musicians who were there, from the audience members who have been interviewed across 5 decades, from the critics who wrote about it, from Cass Elliott's face in D.A. Pennebaker's footage, her hand raised toward her mouth in involuntary awe, is the quality of surprise. Not the pleasant surprise of something better than expected, but the deeper surprise of something that did not fit any available expectation, something that arrived from outside the categories and made the categories feel insufficient. This was precisely the quality that had made the voice unsignable to the man who had heard it in 1966. The same quality, the same voice, the same rawness and apparent lack of control, the same thing he had identified as a commercial defect, was the thing that made 50,000 people in a field in California understand, in real time, that they were witnessing something they had never witnessed before and might never witness again. The record labels who had passed on her were in the audience at Monterey or heard about the performance within hours. The same professional assessment apparatus that had produced the rejection was turned, almost overnight, toward signing her. Clive Davis, then head of Columbia Records, has described hearing about the Monterey performance and moving quickly, the speed itself a measure of how completely the context had changed, how thoroughly the performance had redrawn the map that the assessments of 1966 had been made on. Cheap Thrills was recorded in early 1968 and released in August of that year. It went to number 1. The voice that had been too raw for commercial music was selling records at the rate that defined commercial success. The voice that had been too uncontrolled was being played on the radio stations that the music industry's commercial infrastructure depended on. The voice that could not be categorized had become the category, the thing that other things were being measured against. The man who said no watched this happen. He had been right about every quality he identified. He had been wrong about what those qualities meant. What the rejection of 1966 ultimately reveals is something more interesting than the fallibility of individual judgment, though it reveals that too. It reveals the specific and consistent way that the music industry, like most industries built around categorical thinking, fails to recognize genuinely new things. Not because the people in it are foolish or uncaring, but because the tools they have developed for recognizing value are built from the past, and the genuinely new thing is, by definition, not in the past. The voice that is too raw, too uncontrolled, too impossible to categorize. These are descriptions of a voice that is doing something the existing categories cannot hold. And because the existing categories cannot hold it, the professional apparatus built to assess commercial potential within those categories will, rationally and reasonably and almost inevitably, produce a rejection. The rejection does not mean the voice is wrong. It means the categories are insufficient, and the insufficiency of the categories is, in retrospect, the first evidence that something genuinely new has arrived. Janis Joplin's voice was too raw, too uncontrolled. The man who said so was right about this and wrong about everything it implied. The voice that could not be contained within the commercial categories of 1966 went on to become the standard by which those categories were redrawn. The voice that was too much for the industry became the industry's most lasting artifact from that era, the recordings that have never gone out of circulation, that arrive with the same force they carried when they were made, that still do what they were made to do for anyone who presses play. The man who said no built no monument. The voice he rejected built something more permanent than any monument, a body of work that has been in continuous conversation with every person who has encountered it for more than 50 years, and that shows no signs of ending that conversation. The rejection was the beginning of the story, not the end of it. The man who said no cleared the path, inadvertently and without intention, by sending Janis Joplin back to the place where the right room was waiting for the voice he could not place. She found the room, she filled it, and the sound of a voice filling the right room for the first time, after years of being told the voice was wrong for every room available, that sound is still in the recordings. It has always been there, it always will be.